Hello and welcome to all of you in the room and all of you online. My name is Matt Matravers. I'm the director of the Morrell Center for Legal and Political Philosophy, and we sponsor today's events. I'm not going to talk for very long because nobody's here to hear me, but I need to say some words of housekeeping and then some words of thanks and then some brief words about the day as a whole. On the housekeeping side, there aren't any fire alarms drills scheduled for today, so if the fire alarm goes off, it's because there's a fire, in which case please follow the instructions of the fire marshals or follow the signs to the fire exit and as on the screen. And I think that's probably it for housekeeping. If you're on Zoom, there will be an opportunity to join the conversation using the Q&A button. Okay. So let me say a few words of thanks. I'd like to thank the C&JB Morrell Trust, which funds the Centre and so funds this event and has funded work in legal and political philosophy at the University of York for almost half a century now. I'd also like to thank Joan Concannon, Sarah Mitchell, and the Festival of Ideas events teams. I'm sure many of you have come to many of the Festival of Ideas events over the years. You will be aware that they don't just happen spontaneously. They require enormous amounts of work, and that work is done by an enormously energetic and absolutely lovely team, and it's a real pleasure to thank them. Third, I'd like to thank our speakers throughout the day and our chairs. It's in the nature of the kinds of people we approach to do these events that they are very, very busy, often very, very important, sometimes very important and very busy. And we don't, the work is hard, but the pay is crap. We don't pay people to come to this, so they're giving up their time voluntarily to help inform and educate and entertain, and I am, and we are all, I think, enormously grateful to the speakers, not just at this session, but throughout the day. Finally, the festival wouldn't be what it is without the audience, so thank you to you for coming along both in person and online, and for engaging in the way that you do with the events that we put on. Michael Ignatieff, who did an event last night and who will be doing an event with us later today, said to me over dinner last night how impressed he had been and how thoughtful the questions had been and how he was going to have to go away and rethink some of his thoughts because of the questions. And it's that kind of engagement that I think makes the festival so special. So thank you very much to you, the audience, both here and online. So let me say a bit about the day. So we start planning this day just after this day, as it were. But a year ago or so, when Joan and I met, we wouldn't have dreamt that we would end up having a day that begins with reflections on a serious war in Europe. We were planning something a little different, but of course, once the war started, it seemed to us unavoidable that we would need to confront it. And so we begin today by looking at the causes, consequences, and so on of the war in Ukraine. And that'll be this morning's session, and that will go on now until 12:30. Then one of the things that's emerged, and I think has in lots of ways surprised lots of people, has been the European response and the way in which the war in Ukraine has shaped Europe as a defensive and strategic player in the world, with consequences for both the United States and for China. So our second session, which starts at 1:15 and will complete at 2:45, looks at Europe and security. And then third, from 3:30 to 4:45, we're going to be looking at the rise of the far right in Europe. And it might seem that that one is a bit of an outlier, that the first two are sort of centrally concerned with Ukraine and the response to Ukraine, whereas the rise of the rise of the radical right, not the Third Reich, there's a Freudian slip there somewhere, might seem as if it's a bit odd. But I don't think that's the case. I think it fits in perfectly. I mean, only an idiot would try to second guess what has gone on in Vladimir Putin's mind. But we should note, it's important to note, I think, that Putin's intellectual gurus, the people he cites as behind his worldview, include people cited by Steve Bannon, Trump's great advisor, and by leaders in places like Hungary. They share an idea that the West is weak and emasculated, woke in some people's terminology. Moreover, they share a disregard and disrespect for the institutions of liberalism that have protected us from the rise of fanatics armed with ideologies of the good. Institutions like an independent press, an independent judiciary, free and fair elections, and most of all, respect for the rule of law. I'm not going to labour the point. We should all know just how much trouble we're in. And we see in Ukraine what can happen when others believe that we've lost faith in the great journey of liberal democracy. So with that, we'll begin, and I'll hand over to my esteemed colleague, Sultan Barakat, who will be chairing this morning's session. Thank you very much.
It's lovely to see you all. Today we will start our panel with a focus on the causes and the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I think we all agree that on the 22nd of February, earlier this year, the world has changed in many ways. From a European perspective, they've certainly started to question many of the assumptions that they've had in place in terms of their own security. Globally, the invasion have had consequences in relation to the way the unipolar world is fast coming to an end, and Russia and potentially China is trying to assert themselves as well. So it's been a very important date, but the story doesn't really start on the 22nd of February. The issue of Ukraine goes much deeper than that, and at least in terms of direct confrontation between Russia and the Ukrainian government, either directly or through the proxy of the separatist groups in the eastern regions of Ukraine, things have been going on since 2014, and some would say since 2013. But for a long time, it went unnoticed, or at least it wasn't of a great importance to the rest of the world. But the Ukrainians have suffered major casualties. Almost 14,000 people were killed between 2014 and 2021. And of course, we should not forget the airliner that was downed in July 2014 and then forgotten. But that incident should have made the international community really question what was going on the ground. To help us understand all this and to reflect on it, we have a fantastic panel with us today, whom we're very grateful that they could make it. And what I'll do is I will introduce the panel first, and then I will come back and address a question to each of them and give them about 5 to 6, 7 minutes to respond. 8 for some, maybe a bit more. And then we will have a conversation to start with between me and the panelists, and then we'll open it to our audience. We're also, today we have a good following on Zoom, online, and they are welcome to address questions online, and my colleagues will make sure that they appear somehow on the screen in front of me, and I'll try and take those questions as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. And immediately to my right, I have Olesya Khromeychuk. I hope I got this pronunciation right. Olesya is a historian. She specializes in the history of Central and Eastern Europe and has written widely about the subject and taught in many UK universities. But today she's with us really mostly because she's the director of the Ukrainian Institute, which is a charity founded in London in 2013. And what Olesya doesn't know about Ukraine is not worth knowing. So she will be also our first speaker. To my right on screen here, we have with us Sam Greene. Sam Greene is a professor in politics, and he heads the Russia Institute at King's College. He's written about Russia a number of books, but the one that is maybe most relevant to our discussion today is the one he's done on Putin versus the people, which was published by, published by an academic publisher. Let me just get it right. Anyway, it was published in the Yale. Was it Yale? So, yes, thank you. Very, very distinguished publisher. And of course, before joining King's College, Sam worked in Moscow, and he was the deputy director of the Carnegie Institute or Center in Moscow. So welcome, Sam. Sam is joining us from Washington, D.C., and we're particularly grateful that he's having to wake up very, very early to be with us. And he will be speaking second. To the left of Olesya, I have my old friend and partner in crime, I think, in Afghanistan, General or Ambassador Stefano
I prefer the general one.
Well, now it's civilian, he's retired. Pontecorvo is a very senior Italian diplomat. He had the responsibility of setting up the first Italian embassy in Kiev. And since then, he's done many senior, filled many senior positions. The most recent to which I knew him, but it's not mentioned in your biography here, is he was the senior civilian representative of NATO in Afghanistan. So anything that happened in Afghanistan in the last 2 years, he's responsible for, including the fall of Kabul in some ways. And I had the pleasure and the honor of working with him closely on the Afghan Taliban talks and the American Taliban talks. Welcome to you. To the left of Stefano is a face that is too familiar to you, I think, familiar, even if he tries to hide now behind his beard. Gavin Esler is a very known writer, broadcaster, podcaster, and he holds many distinguished awards, and he has particular interest in Putin, as you will see. But for us as a university, I think we would like just to acknowledge that he's the chancellor of the University of Kent. So you can see from the panel we have, we're going to have a very interesting discussion. Stefano, we're not in Italy here. I'm talking.
I was trying to civilize you guys, but that's
it's all right. There is no interpretation for the law here. Okay, we'll start with Olesya. And given her knowledge and sort of follow-up of what's going on in Ukraine very closely, if you could please give us an idea of the general context. What are the issues that led us to where we are today?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for organizing this panel and giving Ukraine a platform, keeping Ukraine in the focus of our attention. I think we're all understand now that we're succumbing to Ukraine fatigue or war fatigue, and I think that's a really dangerous thing to do. Hopefully we'll come back to that because we've already seen consequences of Ukraine fatigue in 2014, so we really can't afford to do it again. Now, I'm often asked to explain Russia's war against Ukraine through history. There's a sort of implication of a hope that once we figure out what went wrong in history, we can figure out what went wrong in the current affairs as well. And that question unsettles me because all neighbors, I suspect, or at least most neighbors have had difficult history with one another, with border disputes, with tensions, economic, cultural, linguistic, and so on. And history does not explain present-day aggression. What does explain present-day aggression is weaponization of history. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we take statements made by Putin, Medvedev, or other Kremlin pseudo-historians as interpretations of history and not weapons of war, we legitimize them and normalize them. So what I'm going to do in my remarks, I'm going to go through a few misconceptions, which I think have been terribly unhelpful in our understanding of the context of what's going on in Ukraine. And then I'll also begin to touch on the question, how did we get here? And I promise I will just begin to touch on it. I won't dwell on it. The first misconception, Russia had valid security concerns about NATO's expansion into its sphere of influence, right? So first, Ukraine was and is a neutral state. And the talk of joining NATO only began in 2014, so after Russia attacked Ukraine. Before that, Ukrainians were pretty skeptical about NATO. I mean, I have to say that there's skepticism about NATO now for different reasons, and we can come back to that. But essentially, nobody was talking about joining NATO before Russia attacked. Second, when we accept Putin's world, which is split into spheres of influence, we accept an outdated, dangerous and imperialist view of the world. And we deprive Ukraine any agency. And really, it's an example of victim blaming. Somehow Ukraine is to blame, or the West is to blame for provoking Putin, etc. That's the implication of acceptance of that misconception. And this idea of spheres of influence also firmly places Russophone speakers as ultimately part of the so-called Russian world. Yeah? And that's also a complete misunderstanding of the linguistic question in Ukraine. So Russophone Ukrainians are not Russians, in the same way as Scots, Canadians, Irish, Australians, and other English-speaking nations are not English. Now, that's quite easy to understand, but for some reason not so easy to understand when it comes to the Ukrainian question. Most vast majority of Ukrainians are bilingual, so speak Ukrainian and Russian, and a lot of them are multilingual as well. There's Crimean Tatar, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian spoken on the territory of Ukraine. And this linguistic diversity is to be celebrated, not to be weaponized, but Putin has weaponized it. The other thing I want to say about the linguistic question is there's a reason why we're bilingual. And there's a reason why we are all able to speak Russian. And that's systemic Russification of the population, both in the Russian Empire and in the USSR. So ranging from decrees issued to ban Ukrainian language publications in the 19th century in the Russian Empire, and to essentially, forcing the population to choose the Russian language over Ukrainian because in the USSR, because your career prospects would be utterly diminished if you didn't. Yeah, so there's a whole range of various ways of forcing Ukrainians to become at least bilingual, if not switch to Russian. And it was essentially Ukrainian that's been threatened for many years as a language, not Russian. And that started to change in 2014. So the state started to invest more attention and funding into Ukrainian language books. Still, Russian books were, outnumbered Ukrainian by a lot. But it started to change things. Films appeared in Ukrainian, music appeared in Ukrainian, and so on. And the Russians took that and weaponized it and started to talk about, Russophone population as being threatened. But like with the question of NATO, that myth backfired. Because when the Russian world arrived in Ukraine, it arrived in February 2022 by shelling Russophone cities, by killing Russophone civilians. So now Russophone Ukrainians are switching to Ukrainian en masse because they perceive their native tongue as the language of the aggressor, and they do not want to speak it. So this is what Putin achieved. And I'm sure that many of you have heard the famous response of the Ukrainian sailors to the Russian warship when they told the warship where to go. I will not quote it in this distinguished company, but it was said in Russian, and that is a slogan of Ukrainian defiance. So something to bear in mind, I think. And the final misconception I'm going to address today is the role of the far right in Ukraine. Yeah? So let me just give you some figures, very straightforward. In 2019, major far-right parties formed a coalition in Ukraine, which gained, anybody wants to guess how many percent what the percentage of the vote it gained?
3%.
Just over 2%. Just over 2%, which meant that they did not reach the 5% threshold to actually gain any seats in the parliament. That is how marginal the popular support of the far right in Ukraine is. And let's now compare it to other European countries. Italy, no offense, Germany, France. Recently, we watched the elections, not to mention Russia, and not to mention the fact that the Russians have been funding the far right in Europe. But the attention has often been on Ukraine and Ukrainian far right. So to sum up this part where I wanted to raise a few misconceptions, when we talk about the questions of so-called denazification or the protection of Russophone population in Ukraine as pretext for invasion in a country which has Russophone Jewish president, I think it's important to mention, even when we raise these questions to debunk them, we're still talking about questions that are imposed on us by the Kremlin. And so our improvement of our understanding of Ukraine is marginal in that case. We learn about Putin's lies. Do we learn about Ukraine? Not so much, in my view. And finally, just in the last minute that I've got left, I want to raise this question of how did we get here? And for me, the most important word in that question is we. We, the international community, how did we get to this situation? Well, we got here by ignoring the first 8 years of this war. And I have to say, that war has lasted twice as long as the First World War. 14,000 people, as you quite rightly pointed out, died in that war. My brother was one of them. He was killed in 2017 in action in Luhansk Oblast near Popasna, the town that nobody heard of until recently because it was razed to the ground by the Russians just recently since the full-scale invasion. 2 million people were displaced, but they were internally displaced, so they were not our problem. They were the problem of Ukrainians, right? But because they were not coming into European countries. And in the meantime, as we ignored it, as we turned a blind eye to this, Russians weaponized not only history, but also energy. They used the trade with the democratic world to fund the war and also fund escalation of the imperialist colonial war and escalation of it. So every time we accepted the violation of international law, starting with occupation of Crimea and parts of Donbass, every day that we purchased Russian oil and gas, every time that we referred to Russian troops and Russian proxies as rebels, implying that the conflict is somehow internal, is civil war. I heard this in mainstream Western media, repeated over and over again. Every time RT Russia Today reports snuck in, polluted our media space, we emboldened Putin. So also we got here by mistrusting Ukraine, by not cultivating expertise on Ukraine, by not teaching Ukraine in universities. I wonder how many of you can guess how many universities teach Ukraine. I'll come back to that gladly later. By letting others speak on behalf of Ukrainians, namely Russia experts. Again, I'm happy to talk about it later as well. So the important question is, what have we done or not done over the last 8 years, and what can we do differently now to ensure lasting peace in Ukraine? And I'd like to emphasize the word lasting peace, so not peace at any cost, but actually ensure that peace will last in Ukraine. I'll stop there. Thank you for being so patient with me. It wasn't 5 minutes, I know.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Olesya. No, you did stick to the time, so it's perfect. Thank you very much. The 3 important points about security of Russia, the Russian-speaking population of eastern Ukraine, and the myth or the issue of the right wing in Ukraine. So we'll come back to that in the discussion, but before we get to the discussion, we'll invite Sam. Sam, maybe if you could please articulate a little bit more on the context of the conflict. Maybe in particular, if you can address some of those issues that were raised by Olesya, would be great. The floor is yours.
Great. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's certainly both a pleasure and an honor to be with you, if not in person, and if not on a topic that is. Well, in circumstances, unfortunately, that are troubling and that are difficult. I don't actually disagree with anything that Olesya had to say, and so providing, expanding on what you said, I think is not something that certainly that I need to do. But there is one point, I think, actually, where I would depart a little bit, and that has to do with when this war began. Right. It's absolutely true. It didn't begin on the 24th of February, 2022. I don't think it even began on the 20th of February, 2014, which is when Russia began its annexation of Crimea, which then led to the intervention in the Donbass. I actually would date the beginning of this war to the 22nd of November, 2004, which was the day that Vladimir Putin, then, just finishing off his first term as president of Russia, decided to make a phone call to Viktor Yanukovych, congratulating him for the first of 2 times, actually, within a couple of weeks on his quote-unquote victory in the presidential elections in Ukraine, elections that sparked the first Maidan, which became known as the Orange Revolution. This was really a transformational moment in Ukrainian politics in a lot of ways, something that I would certainly defer to Olesya on, but it was transformational Russian politics as well, and I think started a process that got us to where we are. And so, if we want to understand both how we got where we are and where we go from here, I think we need to pay attention to that part of the history as well. So, I mean, 2014 looks to me, albeit from the outside, and not as a Ukrainianist, as really the failure of an authoritarian project in Russia, right? This is a moment in which an outgoing president, Leonid Kuchma, is, unlike Putin, not in a position to reshape the constitution to allow him to reign indefinitely, but he has powerful interests that he wants to continue to protect, and he tries to hand off power by subverting elections to a chosen successor and in service of we'll call it plainly a corrupt elite. This is a moment, not the first moment, but a critical moment at which the Ukrainian population rise up and say, no, we're not going to have this. We have sovereignty over our own state, right? This comes in many ways as a shock to Putin, right? Because Putin has spent most of the time from coming to office until 2004 trying to consolidate his control over the elite. And he sees the elite really in Russia as the key threat to his ability to be sovereign and to consolidate the power of the state. So he focuses on television, he focuses on the oligarchs, he focuses on political parties, he focuses on governors and so on. But he doesn't focus on the population, he doesn't see the population as a threat. He sees the population as fundamentally manipulable. 2004 marks a moment after also the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the bulldozer revolution in Serbia, as a moment in which he begins to think he has to take the population more seriously. He still doesn't assign a lot of agency to it. He seems to see popular uprisings as something that are fomented by the West and ordinary citizens as really not capable of having their own agendas, right? But it begins a period in which he sets up what we begin to think of as Fortress Russia, right? He begins to consolidate control over Russian civil society, over the Russian media space more broadly, over the Russian political space, and to try to insulate it from foreign influence, right? So if we fast forward 10 years, right, from 2004 to 2014, right, we see a consistent process of the centralization of power in Russia, one in which Putin's mass legitimacy, his ability to create the outcomes in elections and in Ukrainian politics that keep him in power, increasingly involve conflict and isolation. Right, so he faces his own popular uprising, not on any Ukrainian scale, but he faces a popular uprising in 2011, 2012. Which he defeats by turning to issues of values, by turning to wedge issues in ways that will be familiar to many of us in the UK and in the United States and in Western Europe, by talking about sexuality, by talking about religion, but critically by talking about a battle of values, right, between Russia and the Western world, right? At the same time, of course, Ukrainian politics remains very boisterous, right? And so even though Yanukovych does eventually come to power, right, through what I would take to be democratic means, right, this does not provide a victory for Russia in terms of its relationship with Ukraine and its geopolitical view of the region. Yanukovych continues to be pulled in multiple directions at the same time, both by his interest in Russia and maybe a relationship that he has with Putin, but also by the fact that he's fundamentally beholden to Ukrainian politics and to the Ukrainian street. Right. The result of that, we can go over the minutiae of the history, right, is that a project from Moscow to try to force Kiev out of an integrational relationship with the European Union leads to another revolution, right? Leads to an uprising that forces Yanukovych out of power. And in order to forestall that, Russia goes to war in Ukraine in 2014, not over NATO, not over geopolitics, but over a trade treaty, right? Again, an anachronism, right? But a reality that we have to that we have to deal with. That war in 2014 reshapes a lot of things, some of which have already been mentioned, but it really fundamentally reshapes Russian politics as well, right? So it takes what had been a rhetorical conflict with the West and it makes it a material conflict. Right, all of a sudden, Russia is now not simply at a political war over values with Europe and the United States, but it is fighting a shooting war, right, and trying to use military force to draw and defend lines on the map of Europe, right? This leads obviously to a demonization of Ukraine, but also a much sharper demonization of the West. It also leads to the treasonization of political opposition in Russia. So from this point forward, anybody who tries to propose a different political course for Russia, a less corrupt course, a more democratic and more accountable course, is not simply speaking out against Putin, but in fact is framed as speaking out against Russianness and the purpose of the Russian state itself. So that by the time we get to 2021 and the last parliamentary elections in Russia, there is effectively no political opposition in the country. There is nobody who was able to contest those elections, nobody who was able to monitor those elections, nobody who was able to cover those elections as journalists with any robustness. All of that said, I'll own up to this. I had a piece in the Washington Post with my co-author Graham Robertson in December of 2021. Right, saying that I didn't think that Russia would proceed with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, with 150,000 troops parked on the border, it was hard to rule out the possibility entirely. But it didn't make sense. Right, there were clear risks on the battlefield. Anybody who thought that this was a war that was going to end in a matter of days clearly wasn't paying attention to what was going on in Ukraine and how Ukraine actually functioned as a state, as a society. There were clear risks to the Russian economy as a result of sanctions and isolation. There were risks in terms of public opinion. There were risks in terms of elite cohesion in Russia. And it was not clear to me what the benefits were for Putin that would outweigh those risks when you added them all up. Which leaves us, I think, with a question: if we want to think about what happens next, right? Did Putin have bad intelligence, right? Which is entirely possible. As bad as we have been in the West at studying Ukraine, and Olesya's critique is absolutely right, Russians have been even worse. Right? Nobody has made a successful academic career since the end of the Soviet Union in Moscow. I'm not exaggerating. Nobody has made a successful academic or political career in Moscow by studying and being an expert on Ukraine. And there's been this baseline assumption among the the Russian political and academic establishment that Ukraine is simply like us in many of the ways that this was describing. And so we don't really need to analyze it. We understand it innately. And so it's entirely possible as other world leaders, including in the capital I'm in at the moment, right, have gone to war on the basis of bad intelligence, that Russia did the same. Right. But the other option, of course, the other possibility is that Putin actually had access to all of the same intelligence and analysis that the rest of us did, but simply interpreted it differently. That questions of identity and history for him, not as an immutable force of international politics, and I would certainly agree again with Olesya about that. History is not fate, right? But I think that we as political scientists, as sociologists, as people who study international relations, maybe need to get a little bit better at taking seriously the power of identity, ideology, and people's interpretations of history to actually shape political behaviors, right? We have, as academics, been beholden to this idea of rational actors. And I think we have come up against an actor who seems to be acting very irrationally in ways that not only threaten peace and security in Europe and on the planet more broadly, but even for Putin's own political project that make Russia less secure, less safe, less prosperous. And that undermine a lot of at least what Putin has said he's tried to achieve in his country over the last 22 years. So we need to become a little bit more comfortable with irrationality. We need to get a little bit better at analyzing it. And I think if we want to have any ability to respond to it in the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those issues, particularly the issue of the focus on the irrationality of Putin and his personal behavior. Because I actually think in the West we have a tendency of reducing issues to individuals. We've heard it before in relation to Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Assad, and so on. And sometimes it may mislead us in terms of the analysis. But we'll come back to that in the discussion. Now, I would like to invite our distinguished ambassador to look at the issue from an international perspective. This invasion received, I think, a relatively swift response from the United Nations. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution on the 2nd of March earlier this year, and in which it deplored and condemned and demanded both the withdrawal and the recognition that Putin has given to the separatist republics. Of course, only 5 nations were against it, and the majority of the nations were for it or abstained. And of course, there was no action at the Security Council level because of Russia's influence. From an international perspective, where do you see this going? And what are the possibilities that the international community could place pressure on Russia to meet the conditions of the UN General Assembly resolution?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Sultan, and to Joe, and I'm very happy to be here also because there's another partner in crime, one of General Giles Hill, who was a senior British officer in Kabul with whom I share the responsibility of the disaster in Afghanistan. We both tried to talk to, and Giles is a hell of a general. We both tried to talk to Uncle Donald and Uncle Joe, but they wouldn't listen. So I mean, he left, and I had stayed behind and to help for the evacuation. But it's great to see you here. The role of diplomacy currently. There are people who are talking to people, as we say in Italian. But as such, currently, unfortunately, diplomacy has no role. Although it's setting up maybe a few issues which are minor to us but major to other parts of the world, like, the Turks are talking about how to get the wheat out of Ukraine. Others are talking about how we can undermine the Turkish effort to do this and have a success. And I'm saying this not to be malicious, but to tell you, there are other channels with the one you talked about, Americans talking to the Russians and the Russians talking to Americans through the Taliban in Afghanistan, of all people. So there's a lot going on. I mean, you don't think that diplomacy, even in a situation like the one that we are living, which is tragic and dramatic and lived on the sacrifice and the skin of the Ukrainian people, first and foremost, is only about getting an end to the war. It's also about positioning oneself around the world, around the issue in a very fractured world, because you reminded us of the UN activity. May I remind all of us that 60% of the world population, represented by the government, did not vote for our position, is not on our position. The Indian foreign minister said it last week quite clearly, not being in a position of attacking the Americans, he attacked the Europeans, saying, during a conference in front of cameras, you Europeans have to understand, you have to quit thinking that Europe's problems are our problems. Europe's problems are Europe's problems, our problems are our problems, but your problems are not our problems. Very clearly taking a distinction between, actually no distinction between the camps. That brings us back to a very fractured situation in which diplomacy actually has a role which is very limited. And it is also very limited because one of the actors, which is the Russians, are not interested as yet. It is the situation on the ground which will define when and where we will go to the table. I must say currently, and I speak in front of a very fervid Ukrainian representative, that my sense is that today, as we speak, and for the foreseeable future, all three of the actors in the Ukrainian crisis are not interested in diplomacy. Also because all three of them move at levels that never intersect. The Russians need not only Putin, but also those around Putin to survive Putin's wrath if this doesn't happen. The Russians need a success which will be defined in some way that he will define. And I was interested in what the previous speaker said. We don't yet know what. Realize that after 4 months of war, we don't yet know what Putin's objectives are. Failure of intelligence you were talking about. So the Russians need victory or some sort of visible success that we cannot give them. The Ukrainians can't give them. The Ukrainians are prisoners and victims at the same time of their success and of a certain way of having become instruments, I'm sorry to say this, of a proxy war between Americans and Russians on Ukrainian soil. The Americans and the rest of us who follow suit are trying to destroy, Austin said it on 26th in Germany very clearly, trying to avoid that Russia can become again a menace, a threat to neighboring countries, which translates directly into degrading the Russian military in a way that it will never be a threat again. Good luck with that. That's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. So we are now on three levels which simply don't intersect. There is no hook on which you can anchor some sort of a peace initiative, which is why people are grabbing at straws, the gas, the grain, and so on and so forth, which is a good way of starting in a situation like this. And so it will be the situation on the ground that will tell us, that will allow the Americans in the background, much like Sultan was during the Afghanistan negotiations. Americans in the background with the Russians and the Ukrainians at the table. At that point, that will be one of the defining, I don't believe, as a diplomat, and I'm looking at this from the perspective that I've always had in my career, which is, let's try to solve things. That's what diplomats should be doing in these, I was in Rambouillet and the Somali crisis and so on. There are no defining moments in history, except, very few of them. But this is not going to be a defining moment in history. It is going to be a defining moment for the West, though, because at that point, for the West as a system of values, it will become very clear that whatever action we take, it'll be a fight between ethics and reality. For ethics, the Ukrainians, we have to push the Ukrainians to conquer the Kremlin. And let's be very clear, my position is this is a Russian aggression, and we should continue to arm the Ukrainians. Ethics would want the Ukrainians to win the war. What does reality tell us? Answer yourselves. I'm not going to give you an answer. You didn't even pay the ticket to come here, so you might as well do some work yourselves. But that's one of the parts. Reality is that we are living with, as Europeans, you're far removed. I'm Italian, I'm pretty much far removed, except that we have ships going up and down in the Mediterranean, which disturb us more or less, but not that much. And we actually can come and gain from the war because we actually, very cynically, all the gas pipelines that are no longer coming from Russia will come from the south, the south of Italy. So it's not, it's not dramatic for us as a nation. It is dramatic as part of the community of values which we very much feel that we are part of. The ethics is Ukraine must win, and to a certain extent it can win. Let's then define what winning is. Getting back to what frontiers. The reality is that we have a nuclear-powered neighbor, because he is a neighbor, with an endless stream of resources that he can tap into, human and economic resources. Let us be under no illusion that the Russian economy is collapsing. It isn't. It simply isn't. Not only because we're buying the gas, because if they will have a trouble spot for a couple of years, but the fact that Mr. Putin has cut 50% of his gas stream to Europe, to Italy, to Germany, to Romania, not to Hungary, shows one thing only to me, is that he can afford it. Not that he's mad, that he is, I don't buy the irrational Putin that, wakes up in the morning and stomps his feet. That's not Putin. That's not Putin. I don't claim to know him well, but I've been in the same room with him for about, more or less, I calculated 30 hours at the time when Berlusconi was our prime minister, and please don't laugh. But he had a very good relationship with sorry, yeah, you can, Sultan. But he had a very good relationship a surprisingly good relationship with Vladimir Putin.
Maybe not so surprising.
Sorry?
Maybe not so surprising.
No, surprisingly, because Berlusconi. I mean, I've never voted for him. Berlusconi has nothing to do with the subject.
Stefano.
He's a good man. He's not a bad man. He likes women. Okay, he's Italian.
Yes.
Okay, so I think I've given the gist of what I think. But there's just if I have another 20 seconds, and I'll end up with that. Diplomacy will come in handy if we play the same game and not play against each other, which is what's happening now. Which is why a very simple issue where everybody has said yes, the wheat to Egypt and Lebanon and so on is not going forward. If we're all on the same thing, then diplomacy will come in very handy in this period of frozen conflict, which is going to be the aftermath of the Russian advance. Thank you, Sultan, for your patience.
Thank you very much. So we do reach the frozen bit. It's not quite yet, it's still very hot and ongoing. And I appreciate the point about ethics versus realities, which we could come back to. But now we'll move to Gavin. Gavin, earlier Sam kind of implied that it's all really about economics and about financial interest and maybe even individual interest. Could you shed more light on the money side of what's going on in this conflict, and particular maybe individual interest in what's happening?
Thank you very much. And I should say, I think I've learned more in the past 45 minutes than I've learned over the past 6 or 8 months. So I'm very thankful for my fellow panelists. My interest in this is much narrower. It is money and lies. Not my money, and I hope not my lies. I'll try to do my best to tell the truth. But I had the good fortune to talk with Joseph Nye about 10 days ago about soft power, what we mean by soft power, and why Putin, over the past 20 years or so, and Putin's people have had such influence with us, because that's our problem, and that is something that we can do something about. And that gets down to 2 kinds of corruption. The first is money, and the second is lies. So let me just take a step back and say, over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been part of a team producing a series of podcasts called The Big Steal, S-T-E-A-L. It's about the biggest theft in history, according to Anders Aslan from the Atlantic Council, who has followed Putin's money much closer than I have. And we agreed this is the kind of Watergate on steroids. Follow the money, and you understand quite a lot about what is going on. And maybe I could begin with one of our other contributors, who's a man called Mikhail Khodorkovsky. You may not remember the name, but he was the richest and, I suspect, the smartest oligarch at the start of the Putin period. And you will possibly remember seeing him in a cage in a show trial. And he then served 10 years in prison. He's now in London, and I've spoken to him quite a lot. And essentially, what happened to him was, in 2003, he took on Putin in a televised debate with a number of other oligarchs. And he said, and he admitted to me, he said, I was naive enough to think that Putin might be a good thing who would crack down on corruption. What I didn't realize was he was corruption. And so Khodorkovsky, he had a chance, he had so much money, he had a chance to escape, but he didn't. He ended up in jail for about 10 years, and as I say, I've talked to him a lot in London. And I tried to get him to say, he was very forthcoming on many things, but he was not forthcoming on why he was put in a cage. Because I thought this was quite important, because I think in the West, Stalin, the show trials of the 30s and so on, even those people, certainly in this country, who were attracted by some versions of Marxist-Leninism suddenly saw what Stalin was. And so sticking a guy in a cage struck me as a very, very bad PR, let's put it that way, as well as the inhumane side of it. Khodorkovsky wasn't very forthcoming on it. He's very matter-of-fact about what happened to him, because Yukos, the company, was stolen from him, biggest company in Russia, essentially, and the money went into various pockets. But Bill Browder, who you may know of from the Magnitsky Act, who also crossed Putin roughly in the same period, who also admits he was kind of naive at the start, thought that Putin would crack down on the Russian mafia before he realized he was the Russian mafia, effectively. As Garry Kasparov, the chess player, told us, all countries have their mafia. In Russia, the mafia has its country. Anyway, Browder I talked to quite a bit, and he's a very straightforward American. And I said to him, why the cage thing? And he said, it's very simple. You are the richest, cleverest oligarch in Russia, and you're in a cage. Supposing you're the 12th richest or the 15th richest oligarch in Russia. But you're not actually in Russia, you're in Cannes with your mistress on a yacht. And you go into one of the rooms of your yacht and switch on TV and see a guy smarter than you and richer than you in a cage. What do? You call Vladimir and say, Vladimir, what do I have to do not to be in a cage? And I said, what's the answer to that? And he said, 50% of your takings. Now, he's elaborating on a story which is fundamentally true, which is that much of the money of what could be a very rich but is now an underdeveloped country went into the hands of very, very few people, and you can check the statistics about GDP per capita and, mortality rates in Russia and so on. It was once described as the USSR, as Upper Volta with rockets, a developing country but with a great nuclear arsenal. It's not that. But the money is something, guess what? That does what Stalinism never did in the West. It's quite attractive to some people, including some political parties. I don't know if you've got any in mind. There are some that are quite close to here. And the money has been funneled into all sorts of ways through, buying a property. Eaton Square is sometimes known as Red Square in London, to certain people who make their business out of dealing with this. Now, the reason that this seems to me to be something we should consider is because for 20 years, there have been things about Putin's Russia which we should have noticed. One was the use of polonium to kill Alexander Litvinenko in London. Now, we did notice it, but not much was done. And then there were all the things that Olesya has talked about. So we can date various things to, what happened to the Skripals, what happened when MH17 was shot down, which was an airliner carrying almost 300 people, which was shot down over part of Ukraine where there was a lot of activity from Russian troops, or at least irregulars, let's put it that way. So why didn't we do anything? Why was it that so many of our prominent people in political parties took money from people with Russian connections? I'm not going to go into all the details about this because actually some people who do end up in court due to our libel laws. But if you do look, if you have social media, have a look on any of the social media that is attractive to you, including Twitter, and look at some of the stuff that Led by Donkeys has done, including a list of many of the people who are political representatives in Britain, members of parliament who've taken Russian money. There's others who have facilitated quick passports, British passports for Russians. Now, I'm saying this because this is something that we should have done years ago. This is something that we've woken up to now. This is something that Bill Browder has been talking about for years. And one of the things, I had lunch with him about 2 weeks ago, and he said to me, the great thing about England is you're so cheap. And I said, what do you mean? He said, £75,000 will buy you a lot of influence. And to some of the Russian oligarchs that we're talking about, this is a tip to a concierge. It's also more than the money given to some of our politicians. So I'd urge you to at least have a look at that and have a think about that, because that is not about them, that is about us. And the final bit, because I'd rather hear more about Ukraine directly, is lying in public life and the normalization of lying in public life on both sides of the Atlantic. We got it with Trump. The Washington Post calculated this is an American president who told 30,000 lies during his 4 years of the presidency. And the longer he was in the presidency, the more lies he told. And this was tolerated to a degree which was almost absurd. I mean, there was a time when he said over Christmas, I'm working hard in the White House. And there was TV footage of him playing golf. It's the trivial lies and the acceptance of money, and I should say the acceptance of money from some of the people that are involved is not illegal. That's the scandal. The scandal is what is allowed. And the scandal is also the toleration of lying in our public life, which diminishes our institutions. And I would suggest to you that while Stalinism was never attractive to most of us, the money and the lying is something which blights our political culture. I'll just end with something Hannah Arendt wrote in 1947. She wasn't, as you will know, as a German Jew, very much a fan of the Nazis, and she was certainly not a fan of Stalin. And she tried to figure out in her book on totalitarianism, what is it that makes people complicit in this? Because we're not all bad, but why do we go along? And she said in 1947, the totalitarian mindset is that of somebody, not a committed Nazi, not a committed communist, but someone who cannot tell the difference between fact from fiction or truth from lies. And I would suggest to you that sometimes when we wake up and read things in our newspapers or see things in television, we are partly in that position. And that is something else that we can do. So Putinism is not an ideology, but it is a style. It's a style based on a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a kind of really unpleasant soft power, which for some reason is quite attractive in the West. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Gavin, and thank you for reminding us that we are also part of the problem. We allow it to continue, and we are, in a sense, the market and the harbor for a lot of this illegal money that takes place. Let me maybe start by pressing Olesya on the issue of the Russian-speaking population, because one of the arguments the Russians present is that these areas, you've defined them as non-Russians, but they may define themselves differently. But they speak Russian, and they have been coming under pressure, particularly since 2014, particularly since the annexation of Crimea, that the Ukrainian government have moved on, tried to prevent the others from demanding the same right for separation or self-determination, whatever. And one of the issues that is often referred to is the thing to do with education and the language used in education. That in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, there was a law passed emphasizing that education can only be in Ukrainian, not in Russian. Is there any truth to any of that, or it's just really all made up?
It's really interesting what sources were used to inform us. I mean, it kind of goes back to Gavin was saying, where do we distinguish between fact and lies and interpretation of fact and weaponization of that? So you say they were being forced. That's not how they identified. What are the sources that we use to know how this population identifies itself? Yeah?
Well, we don't have much access to that population. It doesn't have a voice in this discussion.
But why doesn't it have why don't we have access? We're talking Russophone population is a large population in Ukraine. I mean, like I said, we're all bilingual, but Russophone population is very large. It's the whole of East and the whole of the South. Essentially that is being profoundly attacked by the Russians right now. And they do have a voice. They've always had a voice in Ukraine. And like I was saying, the laws that were being passed, the insistence on at least some quotas on the radio and in bookshops to have Ukrainian language products.
Is it true that education can only happen in Ukrainian language?
No, of course. Minority languages are protected in Ukraine. And that's not just Russian. It's also Hungarian, Bulgarian, Romanian, Polish, Crimean Tatar, and so on. It's Ukrainian language that needed protection. If you went to bookshops, over 80% of the books there would be in Russian. It started to change a little. I mean, I struggled to find Ukrainian language books in Kyiv until 2014, and it's still far from ideal. There's still so little Ukrainian products, Ukrainian language products available at the moment. This is twisting reality. No Russian speakers have ever been repressed. Speak to them, listen to them, precisely, Russophone Ukrainians, listen to them. And the other thing that is profoundly misunderstood is, yes, you can be ethnically Russian. You can be Russophone, ethnic Russian, a Ukrainian citizen, and Ukrainian patriot. And I'll give you an example of a film director from Crimea who was ethnic Russian, who was Russophone, and who was from Crimea. And he was sent to jail, Olesya, filmmaker, and he was sent to jail by the Russians, illegally kidnapped essentially, on trumped-up charges, tortured for 20 years in a Russian jail. That is the reality of the situation. The fact that we talk about invented repression of Russophone population, which is just entirely untrue, but we don't talk about repression of Crimean Tatars in Crimea, both historic, so going back to Stalin and 1944. You're right, you're absolutely right, Sam. We need to talk about history. What I was trying to say, we can't use history to explain Putin's aggression at the moment, but we need to talk about history because history informs us. So briefly mentioning 1944, that's when Crimean Tatars were deported out of Crimea, accused of en masse collaboration with the Nazis, and simply deported. It was essentially a genocide of Crimean Tatars. And they are being persecuted. They were only allowed to come back in the 90s to Crimea. And they are being persecuted and have been persecuted since 2014, profoundly, essentially hunted down, sent to jail on extremist charges. And another thing about history I'd like to mention that is misunderstood, and that refers to your question, is the identity of Ukrainians. We talk about nationalism, bearing in mind the bad press it's received in the 20th century, sort of going back to the Second World War. But we misunderstand Ukrainian nationalism of today. And that is based on civic political identity. And it's based on unity, regardless of your linguistic, of your ethnic, of your political position. It's based around unity of protection of statehood, because statehood is about rule of law. It's about protection of your rights. And so Ukrainians will come together, regardless of their differences, and there are differences, and that's normal. They exist in every single country. But they will come together as Ukrainian nationals, and nationalists, if you wish, but not of ethnic kind, to protect their rights and their statehood. And I believe that the root of that is in the statelessness, the history of statelessness in Ukraine. We perceive statelessness as weakness a lot. I think historically we look at stateless or states that have a long periods of statelessness as ahistoric. Yeah, Ukraine didn't exist on our mental maps for a long time because it didn't have a state, and because realists after the First World War preferred to use it as a buffer zone and essentially strengthened the future Soviet empire and Poland at the expense of the people in the middle. But for Ukrainians, statelessness meant development of the sort of identity that rejects oppression from the outside and inside. Yeah, and creates this political nation. And that we've seen the development of that civic political society really flourishing since 2014.
Right, thank you so much. Sam, if we could please follow up on the same line of thought. I mean, clearly there has been a revival in Ukrainian nationalism in the way that Olesya have described it. And it has coincided with a revival in Russian nationalism at the same time, because Russia, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, has been largely humiliated, economically devastated, etc. And it took a long while for it to rebuild. And Putin, regardless of what we think of him personally and the issues of corruption and so on, has played an important role in reviving this Russian nationalism. To what degree do you think that has played in the Ukrainian war, and in particular in the majority of the population now seeming not to question Putin's special operations, as he puts it. And they seem to be going along with him in Russia.
Yeah, it's complicated and it's difficult. I would actually start, because I think part of the answer begins in the comparison with Ukraine. You know, I spoke earlier about sort of the failures of analysis from the Russian perspective, but there was at least one major failure of analysis from the Western perspective, which again comes down to the resilience of the Ukrainian state, right? And the extraordinary degree to which it's continued to function during this war. But the Ukrainian state has been resilient, I think, not because so much it has, you know, some kind of strong, you know, command and control structure institutionally, but because exactly of the commitment to Ukrainian statehood among ordinary Ukrainians that Olesya was talking about, right? Ukraine has gone through a social process since actually before the end of the Soviet Union, right? Of people thinking and talking publicly about what the purpose of the Ukrainian state is, what it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to be a Ukrainian citizen, and what it means to have Ukraine as a state in the world system, right? And this is something really that Russia has not done internally since the end of the Soviet Union, right? Russia did not gain independence from the Soviet Union. It simply emerged from the Soviet Union as a new political entity with one foot in the past and a lot of ideas about where it might go in the future, but in a lot of ways that both under Yeltsin and Putin actually spent a lot of time avoiding ideology, avoiding civic nationalism, and avoiding a contested conversation about what the purpose of the Russian state is. So that when the Russian state when Russia itself became much more prosperous, really as a result of some reasonable economic reforms, and we'll hand that to them, right? But also a lot of good luck when it comes to commodity prices on global markets. It did so in a way that really did not reinforce a link between the Russian state and the ordinary Russian citizen, right? Putin has never invested in a material relationship with Russian citizens, right? It's been a very austere budget always, right? He's been very careful in terms of the way he spends money. He spends money, though, on the security services and on the state apparatus. He does not spend money, by and large, on the Russian population. He leaves ordinary citizens to fend for themselves. And so while people have become more prosperous and have become more secure, right, they don't, by and large, actually see the state as having, see even Putin as having responsibility for that, right? Where Putin is useful for people is as a symbol, all right? So when you are in a state where Putin has created dominance over the public discourse, over messaging, over television, over politics consistently over the last 22 years, right? You know, most of us who live in the UK or in the US or in most Western contexts, right, we are sort of embedded in our political communities. We have a sense of legitimacy in those political communities, and that has some power and some dominance and some sway over us. But we accept a degree of differentiation. It's okay to have a different view than mine. I accept that there are some people in the UK who vote Tory, right? I don't understand them, right? But they're there and it's okay, right? And I accept that they will understand that I vote differently in the UK, right? But in the UK, that's, you know, a 50-50 split, more or less, right? Whereas in Russia, what's consistently been communicated to people is it's not a 50-50 split. It's an 80-20 split or an 85-15% split, which means if you are in that 15%, you're very much marginalized, right? If you're in this situation of a country where you can't rely on the state to support you as a citizen, right? That has a large degree of corruption, where personal relationships with people in positions of power matter very much, right, to your prosperity and your security, then projecting trustworthiness to your social surroundings and to the state itself is incredibly important. And Putin becomes a very easy symbol for that. Right? Putin becomes a very convenient method of saying, you know, I'm normal, right? I understand how this society functions, and thus you can trust me, right? And it becomes very, very difficult for people to pivot away from that, right? So what we've seen in the context of this war, unlike, right, the public reaction to the annexation of Crimea, which was a genuine I think mistakenly, but for a lot of reasons, for a lot of Russians, a genuinely euphoric moment. It created a real sense of pride and hope. I think, with a lot of state propaganda and for all of the wrong reasons. But sociologically, we have to acknowledge that that's what happened, right? The emotions bound up in this war and the public reaction to this war in Russia are emotions of fear and emotions of anger. And that creates a very different kind of relationship, a very different kind of political relationship. What the annexation of Crimea did was it bound ordinary Russians to one another in a horizontal relationship that created a sense of political pride. What this war, I think, is doing is beginning actually to break down those relationships, because people understand the hardships that they face. People understand that while yes, the Russian economy is not in free fall, things have become much less comfortable and much less certain, and the level of economic anxiety has increased. People are dying, and the burden of this war is disproportionately falling, as it usually does in wars in most countries, on disenfranchised socioeconomic and ethnic groups within the country. That's creating friction, right? And as those horizontal ties break down, the state is trying to replace them with coercion, right? With fear, with the idea that if you speak out publicly against the war, whether that's through independent media, to the extent that there are any left in Russia, whether that's on online social media, which you can access through a VPN, or whether that's, we've had cases of people prosecuted for conversations they've had on cell phones in coffee shops that have been overheard by people who snitched on them, right? That you can face, up to 15 years in jail for this sort of thing, right? And so the sense of fear of ostracism and fear of disconnection from society, I think, is for the moment producing compliance. But I'm not entirely convinced that we should mistake that compliance for enthusiasm.
Great, thank you so much. Very important point. Ambassador, you described how little diplomacy is able to do at the moment, and it seems at best they're addressing the symptoms. It's to do with the grains, the gas, oil, etc. Moving forward, I mean, what they've done effectively, at least from our point of view, are the sanctions. How do you see those sanctions? And maybe the question is also addressed to Gavin in terms of the money trail, that some of those sanctions have been quite hard and they've come in fast. But they have a kind of blind spot, it seems, that they're affecting Europe as much as Russia in some ways. How do you see it, and do you see it as an effective way to bring Putin back?
The short answer is no, and I can stop here, but I'll elaborate as I have 5 minutes. And putting a microphone in the hands of a diplomat is always a masochistic act by those who put them in the hands of sanctions generally are ineffective. There is not one. By the way, I speak, and I shouldn't say this, actually. I am the author of the sanctions policy of the EU when I was an EU official. And I created the committee and so on. And so I know a thing or two about sanctions. Sanctions have never brought down a dictator, never brought down a regime change, have never made the population change its mind. One example on all, Iran. Iran has been under sanctions for the best part of 35 years. Iran, as stable as it gets. Cuba has been under sanctions for a number of years. South Africa has been under sanctions for 40 years. In South Africa, they have had a virtuous role. So South Africa is actually an industrial powerhouse in Yugoslavia rather than Iran and so on. It creates distortions of markets and actually worsens the political situation within the country because you get the mafia in power. Because at a certain point, power is tied to money. Inexorably, those who profit from the sanctions then generally become the next generation of politicians. So sanctions are why they are having an effect in in these days, in doing what Sam was saying, which is changing the perception. The official sanctions are a signal. The fact that the private sector is leaving Russia now is having a real effect on Russians. I lived 8 years in Russia. Russians are a bit like, a number of others who like to enjoy themselves. When they understand that they can no longer go to Italy and have have their weekends and out. Although I was in Sicily yesterday, and there were a lot of Russians around, surprisingly many. Russian speakers. They can no longer.
Ukrainian to displaced Ukrainians. No, I'm not even joking. That's true.
No,
if you can't
true.
Distinguish between the two, there's 7 million Ukrainians displaced at the moment. Vast majority of them are Russophone.
Yeah. Well, I was in a 5-star luxury hotel, so I had somebody else's experience, so I very much doubt they were Ukrainians, but I'm sure that we'll get there. Running out of time. Sanctions will be doing, is to split the West.
Is to
Split the West. Because, I often hear this thing which is right, which is, the economy of Russia is the size of the economy of the state of New York. Correct. But the state of New York does not produce 70% of gas, petrol, and so on. So that's a long story, but sanctions are going to undermine the diplomatic unity of the West in going forward.
Great, thank you so much. And Gavin?
Well, I thought I would cheer everybody up by something I've been told recently by sources that I cannot possibly verify, but it's about money, and it made me laugh. Somebody told me back in February, watch out for the rivalry between the FSB and the Russian military, and gave some reasons for that. I thought that was quite interesting. And then more recently, I was told about one thing I could never figure out was why, when the Russians took a bite out of Georgia, a small bite, when they did cyber or hybrid warfare against Estonia in 2007, when they moved into Korea, and the West's response was vaguely pusillanimous, it seemed to me, why they didn't just take another bite, do what appears to be happening now, which is in the Donbass. Why this massive sort of... I'm not any military expert, but everything I've read suggests it was a very strange thing to do given the capacity of the Russian troops. But it was explained to me by someone connected to the Foreign Office who said there's been 100 FSB officers arrested, which I think was in the newspapers as well, which is very interesting. And it was said that they were arrested because they gave bad information to Vladimir Putin. There is another version of this, and I say I can't verify it, but it did actually, in this horrible crisis, make me laugh, which was that those 100 FSB agents were given over the past few years vast amounts of money to suborn, to bribe mayors and others in Ukraine, and failed because they stole the money. So the idea that a kleptocracy fails in its biggest military adventure because somebody stole the money strikes me would be very appropriate. As I say, I can't check it, but it's almost too much fun to believe. So the corruption internally, the rivalry internally, it's something I'm not an expert about, but others are. And I think that is one of Putin's obvious problems. He doesn't sit at one end of a table just because of COVID. As somebody, a German diplomat, said to me, it's because he was in Dresden for a very long time and he knows about the Stauffenberg plot where something was put under a table to kill Hitler.
Well, on that point, we'll turn to our audience in the room for questions. We still have 10 to 15 minutes. I will take a round of 3 questions, 4, 5, 6, they're going. Please start. If you can introduce yourself and ask the question and be as direct as possible, please.
Sure. Thank you for this great panel. Jarosław Kuisz from the University of Warsaw and Liberal Culture. Olesya, you started with the question, how did we get here? And even in this discussion, it was possible to see that under the pressure of the so-called reality, that we fell apart to some extent. And I wonder if we what do you think about this construction of we that is going on? I think that it's going on many levels. We are talking about the Ukrainian identity that is being constructed under the war circumstances. We have the we as the West that is being under construction as well. But still, one could tend to think that there is too little of the we. We are talking more about now, it's 100 days since the war started, and we are talking about the boredom, war boredom. We are talking about the economic consequences, that how the sanctions backfire. And as you, Mr. Ambassador, reminded us rightly so, we are talking also about the reality of the Russia as an empire and its circumstances. So my question is, in which terms do you think that we could construct the we to get out of the war? Because that's one of the main questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We'll take 2 more questions and then, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are actually many questions I'd like to ask, but the main one will be, perhaps mainly for Olesya, the separatist revolt in the Donbass in 2014. To what extent was this a genuine revolt from presumably people in Ukraine who were ethnic Russian and felt discontented? And to what extent was it perhaps a Russian fabrication? And if it was to some extent a genuine revolt, what was the reason for this? And how are they likely to be feeling now that the war has been going on? My name is Alan Taylor, by the way.
Thank you, Hal. And the young lady at the back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for today. I have a question in regards to the pattern of Russian aggression. We know that Russian aggression predates Putin. There's Abkhazia, Transnistria in the 90s. Putin came in 2000s, more Russian aggression. And I've heard a few naive, in my opinion, comments about how, oh, we'll get rid of Putin, everything will be fine. I don't believe that, and I wonder what your opinion is. Thank you.
Great. Olesya, if you could please start by responding to the issue of we, the construction of we, and the issue of the separatists.
Yeah. Yaroslav, thank you for that question. It's a really important question. I think that we should all think about. Not sure we can answer right now, but a couple of things I'd like to mention is that that has been a sense of we, much more than Putin expected there to be. In Europe, there's been unity, and I think that was, he completely miscalculated. He assumed that there wouldn't be unity in the democratic world, and in Europe in particular. He's put a lot of effort into ensuring that there isn't unity, but that didn't happen. There was. Now, the question remains: how much further can that unity stretch? Interestingly, I was listening to a discussion between Serhiy Kelchuk, a historian, and a Ukrainian intellectual, Mykola Repchuk, and they pointed out that in official documents, Ukraine has never been, EU documents, Ukraine has never been referred to as European nation. Until recently. It's only just a couple of days ago that publicly it was mentioned as Ukraine is part of the European family. So this caution of keeping Ukraine somewhere in a buffer zone, in a black hole between the cracks, was very much a strategy coming from the European Union in particular. But now it's changing, and I want to see how far the rhetoric can stretch into inclusion of that we. And I think the other thing we need to remember when we think about we, is that both pragmatically and morally, this is our war. And we all making sacrifices, but let's compare the sacrifices of increased cost of living, or turning our heating down in winter, that kind of stuff. Those sacrifices that we need to make as Europeans here, versus those sacrifices that Ukrainians are making at the moment when they are dying in absolutely enormous numbers. I don't know if you've been following, but recently the suggestion is that up to 1,000 soldiers, servicemen and women are killed every day in Ukraine, and Ukrainians, yeah, and that's not to mention civilians and all of those mass graves that you've all seen. Let's bear those losses in mind when we look at our sacrifices that this war is costing us. So that's on the question of we. We need to, I'll just very quickly refer back to my brother when he went back, he finished his first deployment after he volunteered to join the Ukrainian armed forces. He wasn't an army man, he was an artist. And he went straight back 3 weeks later, and I was talking to him and I said, why are you doing this? Stay civilian, reintegrate into civilian life. Don't go back. I was obviously very worried about him as a sister. And he replied and said, look, you're a historian, you do all this work, whatever, but what you don't realize is that this is a European war, just started in eastern Ukraine. And I didn't want to listen to it. I didn't want to realize that. But that is what all veterans said. Putin will escalate. So when now Ukrainians are saying, unless Putin is defeated, unless this war finishes in Ukraine, he will escalate into other parts of Europe, I understand that other Europeans don't want to hear that, because I was in the same position. I didn't want to hear that it was going to go beyond eastern Ukraine and Crimea at the time, but the signs are there that it could. On the separatist movement, again, thanks for that question. So no, we have data that predates 2014 invasion, and there's no data that suggests that any genuine separatist movement was in existence. There were tensions, there were political cliques, there were oligarchic wars, if you wish, but no separatist movement as such. It was fabricated. Russian nationals were in charge of that. Let's remember this. Not Ukrainian citizens, but actually people shipped from Russia who were in charge of that movement. And that was in 2014. And then obviously continued. And then obviously they found people, sympathizers, collaborators who were local, and that happens in all conflicts, in all wars. The question that is important for us that we need to remember that it was fabricated. But the question that we need to ask ourselves now, and the Ukrainian government, I'm sure, is thinking about, is how we're going to reintegrate those people. 8 years have changed a lot. They've changed the way people think. I understand that there's also, among civilians, there's a feeling of abandonment as well on those territories. I think the fact that they've been completely switched off from Ukrainian information world and consumed only Russian information has also altered their view of the Ukrainian state. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult to reintegrate them, to reintegrate Ukrainian civilians who are on occupied territories, who have been occupied for 8 years. What are the leaders, separatist leaders, are doing at the moment? That's very interesting, because a lot of them end up in the same basements where they've been putting Ukrainians who oppose their regime. They are being tortured in that same Olesya isolation concentration camp that they created in Donbass. If they show some signs of lack of loyalty, for instance. Some are looking for ways out of this. Some, I'm sure, will simply, change the political affiliation when it becomes convenient.
Thank you very much, Olesya. Now let's move quickly to the question of Putin. Would it be possible to get rid of Putin, and would it resolve the issue?
I'll take 30 seconds. I don't think we even want that. I mean, if you look at the recent history, as I say, it was 8 years in Russia. You go from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin, then to whom? Shoigu, Patrushev. I mean, I'm not sure you want that. Although much worse than Putin, you can't go. On the other side, I think the diplomat is always the nasty guy, because they pay us well enough to be that, but because you have to be realistic, and you have to try to have the elements to try to solve the issue at hand. And coming to that, you were talking about the we. There is no we. There is no we. There is a West, which is a good community of values that in the end keeps us together. But they are, the West is the Anglo-Saxons and then everybody else. But there is a community of values. So in the end, there is a we that drifts apart, but then comes back because we all believe in the same thing. Has any of you, I mean, I make the comparison, and I'll leave you the floor, between Navalny and Machiavelli. They are the two most quoted people, Machiavelli in history and Navalny in today, without having been read. Read Navalny. And you will find in Navalny, who is the anti-Putin, as nationalistic as it gets.
Yes.
So.
Well, I have very little time. I have no idea what the future holds for Putin. I do think about the question of we or us, there is at least a sense of them. We are not like the people who are destroying Ukraine, and that has helped put us together. I can't remember who it was, but I spent the 1990s in the Clinton White House at a great time of Western triumphalism, liberal values, third way, all that kind of stuff. And there was some Russian commentator who said, I can't remember who it was, but he said, "We've done the most terrible thing to you. We've denied you an enemy." Now, I get that point, because from that point, partly because of our own hubris and partly because of our divisions within Europe and elsewhere, things have not been quite so clear. But we now, at least if we don't have an enemy, I don't think the people of Russia are an enemy, we do have a threat, and it is a threat to all of us, and that does focus our minds, even if we're not entirely all on the same page.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the last word to Sam on the issue of Putin and on the need to keep Russia stable and stabilizing it. I mean, this is what drove the West back in 1988 because of nuclear weapons and whatever it owns. No one can afford to see a dismantled Russia. How do you see things?
Certainly, a political process in Russia that led to civil war in Russia would be in nobody's interest, right? Least of all the Russian population, or really anybody else's. But that's, I think we also need to be humble about, as much as we might desire to see a different kind of government in Russia, or to think that there might be some leaders that we might like more or less after Putin or instead of Putin, the reality is that we outside of Russia will have very little control over that. Just as Russia was never able to exercise any real control over who's in power in Ukraine, right? This is not within our wheelhouse. But look, to this question of is Russia historically fated to do this? Every empire was an empire before it stopped being an empire, right? Every colonizer was a colonizer before it stopped being a colonizer, and every democracy was an autocracy before it became democratic. So I have no reason to believe inherently, right, that Russia will always be as it is, right? But the speakers and others have mentioned this. It's absolutely right that there's a set of institutional incentives and economic incentives and political incentives that have led Russia down this road, right? So if we want to be in a different place, and I think that we do need to be clear about the we here, right? The reality is that this is not just a threat to Ukraine, and it's not just a threat to nice values about democracy, although it is all of that, right? It's a threat to a world in which we thought we had stopped going to war over trade treaties. It's a threat to the nuclear non-proliferation regime, because try explaining at this point to any mid-sized state that they should ever give up a nuclear deterrent or a nuclear program, that's out the window if Russia wins this war, or even if Russia doesn't lose this war, right? If Ukraine is forced to give up even the 20% or so of its territory that is currently occupied by Russia, right? We will have no legs to stand on with Iran, with Israel, with North Korea, with South Africa, with anybody else who might in the future seek a nuclear deterrent. Right? Is that a world that we want to live in? Right? And I think we need to be very clear about what's at stake here. Right? That means, right, if we want to get to a different future, that we're going to have to eventually think about a way in which Russia, as well as Ukraine, is embedded in a different set of relationships, right? That do give Russia, not under this leadership, I can't see that happening, but down the road, a different kind of prospect, a prospect in which integration is seen as a better path, not just for Russian citizens, but for Russian elites than war. That's a conversation we'll get to have, but we'll only get to have it, I think, once this war is over.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid I must bring it to a close. We've run out of time. But there is another session immediately after the break, which will continue the discussion on Ukraine. What we've done very well, I think, is we've laid the foundation to a better understanding of the context. So please do join us in the coming panel, which will be managed by Gavin, so it will be much better managed in terms of time. And I'm one of the panelists, so I'll say even less. And you'll have more time to ask your questions. And I do apologize for those online as well who followed us. Many of their questions I have integrated in my initial questions. But thank you again, our panelists. This has been absolutely fantastic. And thank you, Sam. You can now go back to sleep. Thank you very much for joining us.